Hello and welcome to Press TV's News Analysis. Coming to you from Tehran, I'm Marzieh Hashemi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, the rumblings of political activism in the United States seem to be getting louder. More and more cities are witnessing protests, whether it is part of the Occupy movement, which is demonstrating against the financial status quo, or whether it is anti-war activists telling Washington to stay out of Iran. The political awareness levels of Americans seem to be on the rise.
Anti-Wall Street protests continue in the U.S., with police raiding encampments set up by Occupy protesters here and there. This is McPherson Square.
This is a peaceful protest! This is a peaceful protest!
Several people were arrested as police attacked to dismantle the protest encampment. The demonstrators are angry with the U.S. government's economic policies, most particularly the tax system, which they say benefits the rich at the expense of the poor. The U.S. government's performance abroad has overshadowed the anti-capitalism protests across America. The demonstrators have held mass rallies in 80 cities across the U.S. against what they describe as Washington's warmongering policies on Iran. They have condemned the Obama administration and Israel over their war threats against Iran, as well as the U.S. sanctions on the Middle Eastern nation. The protesters have also slammed the assassination of Iranian scientists, blaming them on the U.S.
This picture could be my son and my grandson.
The American public is beginning to rise up over the serial errors that have happened with Afghanistan, with Iraq, with Lebanon, with Palestine, and with Iran, and in this region committed by the Bush and the Obama administrations. I think it's not just the chickens coming home to roost, but I think the American people have had enough. They've had enough of wars for Israel against the American national interest.
Many Americans, including former officials, are growingly angry with what they see as Washington's blind and unwarranted support for Israel, which has continued since the regime's creation in 1948. The U.S. has been losing its grandeur in the eyes of Muslim nations since a long time ago. Muslim nations regard Washington as complicit in the crimes committed by the Israeli regime.
I'd like to welcome my guest to the program. From Washington, human rights and international lawyer, Mr. Paul Wolf. And from San Francisco, from the Occupy movement, a protester, Mr. Mark Mason. And here in the studio with us, Mr. Webster Tarpley, author, journalist, and lecturer. Welcome, all of you, to the program. Well, let's start this off. I'm going to start right here in the studio since you have joined us here in Tehran, Mr. Tarpley. Let's look at the demonstrations that were held on Saturday now. On Saturday, there were demonstrations throughout the United States and some other countries, including Canada, and basically talking about stopping the war in Iran, no war in Iran. First of all, does it make a difference to have these type of demonstrations? When we look at back to the prelude of the last war on Iraq, the U.S. war on Iraq, we know that there were a lot of anti-war demonstrations being held and trying to demand that Washington not go into Iraq, but it didn't change anything. Does it make a difference?
It might make a difference this time because Bush-Cheney were relatively impervious to that kind of demonstration, even though they were very large. Obama needs left cover. He needs it like he needs air to breathe. And if he's getting an attack on his left flank from an anti-war movement coming back after a long period when it had collapsed, that's a significant political problem for Obama. So I wouldn't want to overestimate the effect, but I think it is important. We have to remember that in 2006, 2007, there was essentially a movement, an anti-war movement. That was also an impeach Bush-Cheney movement. There was also a 9/11 truth movement. And what Obama was able to do is to wreck all of those. He essentially neutralized everything. So that when we had the attack on Libya this past spring, summer, the resistance was basically nothing. In other words, the protest movement was practically non-existent. So anything that would get the anti-war movement back in the streets would be important. We have to remember how this control is exercised. A lot of the anti-war groups are foundation funded. And the foundations were willing to fund them when it was Bush-Cheney, but now that it's Obama, they're not, because Obama comes from this world of the foundations. In particular, I would say the sort of Soros group of foundations. So if this movement could be brought back, that would be a good thing.
Okay, well, let me switch over to Mark Mason in San Francisco. Do you think that the protesters can make a difference? And where do you see this particular movement going, if anywhere, with this no war on Iran being their basic slogan or the main slogan?
The Iraq War was perhaps the one started by the most recent George Bush. That may have been the first war in recorded history. It was actually the protesters came out in the street before the war, before the invasion. And I think that in itself was a historic moment when the people of the United States went out into the streets to actively protest the sort of pending program to invade a foreign country, obviously to steal their oil resources. So the protests that we had yesterday here in the financial district in San Francisco and around the country, they are a beginning, not an end to the struggle to end all wars. And so I think it is very significant, the activities that are taking place here. The anti-war movement in the United States is not disconnected from the international venue where we have tens of thousands of people in Tahrir Square and tens of thousands of people in Moscow in the streets as well. This is an international popular uprising.
Well, Mark, Paul, how significant is that? Now, Mark has talked about that they see this connection to the international community. We know usually in the United States, in the past, if we look at other movements in America, they have been limited, I would say, in the international perspective to seem like they're in one movement. It seems this time around that things are different. They see a connection. We know one of the main sayings with the Occupy movement in the early days was from Tahrir to Times Square. So how significant is this international connection to this movement? Paul, can you hear me? Okay, well, hopefully we can get that connection fixed with Paul.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Go ahead.
We were having some audio problems, but I think it's solved now. I think that it's very significant. Remember back in October, there were protests in I think there's a very long delay. I'll answer your question, and you can cut me off if it's not working. I think that we saw protests in all 50 states back in October, and essentially they came to an end because of the cold weather. So what we're seeing now is the weather is improving. People are able to come back out into the streets. You know, it's very difficult to camp in a tent when it's below zero outside. As far as the effect this will have on the United States government's policies, I'd be a little more skeptical than your other guests, because these are people who really are not campaign contributors. These are people who are self-described as not having a lot of money, and in some cases, even homeless people are joining these protests. So how significant are any of these demographic groups in the next presidential election? And of course, that's what Obama and the other politicians are thinking about right now. But I think that you have made a very interesting point. These protests started out essentially as being protests against economic inequality, but they have been joined by people who are essentially anti-war protesters. And what these issues have in common is that the United States is spending an enormous amount of money to support wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, the list goes on, maybe even Iran in the future. And what has the United States gotten for any of this? Is the American people better better off because of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think that the wars are essentially bankrupting the United States. More than half of our tax dollars are spent on these wars. No one can really explain why we're having this long series of wars. So the issues do make sense in going together. But in terms of the actual effect on the policies, I just don't think that the people who are out protesting have very much influence. And I give them a lot of credit. They're getting arrested. Sometimes they're getting beaten by the police. They're not being allowed to protest, which they have every right to do. But as far as the actual effect, I'm not sure that it's even possible to affect the United States policies at this point. And the only thing that can really stop the trajectory that the United States is on right now is some kind of a disaster. And we're starting to see an economic disaster. I think if the United States tries anything at all with regard to Iran, the economic impact of that on the world oil prices will be enormous. So I think I'm not sure where that situation is going, but if it does lead to some type of military confrontation, I think that will be kind of the straw that broke the camel's back.
Okay, what about that, Webster Tarpley, what our guest has said, that he doesn't think that it really, that they can make a difference, those people who are out in the street, and that with all the wars that the U.S. has been in, basically the American people have gotten nothing from it. Of course, some would argue that 1%, though, have gotten even more wealthy. So can they make a difference being on the streets?
Well, let's, as one of the speakers suggested, let's take an internationalist approach, because it's not just whatever protest can be mounted in the U.S., although I have a point of difference. We need to distinguish the authentic anti-war movement from color revolutions or CIA people power coups that are being attempted to destabilize a government, say, like Russia. The so-called white revolution in Moscow, in my view, is a CIA NATO project to try to overthrow Putin. And what would that mean? Let's look at what we just had yesterday. We had a resolution brought into the UN Security Council that would have been the first giant step towards a war involving Syria, which would target Iran and the other forces that are allied with Iran and Syria around the Middle East. If we didn't have Putin, if we were back to Medvedev would have let that go through, as he did the Libyan resolution. So I think we have to be a little bit more sophisticated and cagey in the international analysis, but I think it's perfectly possible. The other thing is this Occupy didn't start in Wall Street. It started in a place called Madison, Wisconsin, and it started almost a year ago now with the reactionary governor of the state trying to bust all the unions. The way you get real results is if you bring the organized labor forces, working class forces, together with the anti-war people. So you better have some hard-hitting demands. You better have a Wall Street sales tax, a student loan amnesty, a stop to all foreclosures, and your anti-war demands. And you better not let some facilitator tie you up in a consensus straitjacket so that you don't get any demands.
So are you saying that they can make a difference?
Sure they can.
Okay.
Sure. And I think defeatism is, you can have the pessimism of the intelligence, but you better have the optimism of the will, right? You can say things are pretty bad. Everybody knows that. But it's time to get active, right? The old saying, get active or get radioactive, probably applies.
Okay. Well, Mark Mason, now you're one of the Occupy movement protesters. Tell me about what you see as far as the movement itself. Do you see the movement getting more organized, more focused? How do you see the changes that have taken place, if any, since, let's say, September, when a lot of you first went on the streets?
There's been much that's achieved in an incredibly short period of time. I would say that the international context of Occupy, whether we're talking about here in San Francisco or Oakland, and nationwide in its connection to Tahrir Square and Moscow, that the question here in the United States that is on our forefront of our thoughts, some of us today, regarding war and the question of war, the questions that are being addressed by those in Tahrir Square in Egypt, the struggle against the military control of the government, and the struggle of the Russians against the so-called Russian oligarchs, it's all one struggle. It's all the same thing with sort of different people in different places with some subtle complex.
Mark, do you think that the average
areas.
person,
we have the Russian
average,
oligarchs
let me just jump in here, Mark.
media.
Do you think that the average person then involved in this Occupy movement in the United States is thinking in the same line, that it's all the same, whether it's the protesters that were protesting in Cairo and are protesting in Cairo or elsewhere, it's all related to the same, if you want to call it ruling class or the elite that is ruling the country and the world?
Well, you just hit the nail on the head. That's what Occupy, if I were one sentence, that's what it's all about. It is the 99%, really has been under attack by the 1% most severely during the past 40 years. And we have the Russian oligarchs, and we have the Egyptian military, and there is a consciousness wave in the United States of what we're going to call the American oligarchs. We have them here too. And that is, I think, part of the groundswell of the consciousness of the Occupy movement, the focus on the appropriate slogan, the 99%.
Okay. All right, get Paul Wolf back in on this. Hopefully there is a less delay. How likely are we to see the U.S. get involved in another war, this time attacking Iran, in your perspective?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? I think there are two very serious situations. One is the situation in Syria. And Syria, we have to remember that the protesters in Syria, they're being called protesters and activists. They're actually armed insurgents. They have machine guns. They have RPGs. That is the beginning of a civil war. And we see the United States and some European countries pushing for an intervention like we saw in Libya, in which we would simply help the rebels using air power but not using troops. Although the Turks have offered to put ground troops in to Syria to fight against the Syrian government. So that is a possibility. We're not going to see Russia and China. I think that the Russians particularly, they felt tricked by the resolution that was put forth on Libya when it very quickly turned into an armed intervention. And that was not what the Russians signed on for. So that's one. The second one, obviously, is Iran. And to me, it has never made sense why the West has been putting so much pressure on Iran, ostensibly for the nuclear program, but in my view, it's really a battle for influence in the region. The region is obviously central to the world supply of oil. So how far will the West go? Because obviously starting a war with Iran will, in the short run, interrupt the supply of oil. So it will be very counterproductive. But despite my skepticism of this, we see continuous, almost every day, we see someone else talking about attacking Iran. So I think that the Iranians are very rightly concerned about this, and the Iranians have to be thinking in terms of national defense. The Iranians have very few options at this point except to defend themselves. And I think that it's great to see groups like Occupy Wall Street or anyone who's using the Internet to do some type of blogging or activism through writing to be really cautioning against this, because this would be much worse than what we saw in Iraq or Afghanistan. This would be a very significant conflict, and the United States can certainly tell the Israelis to back off. Israel is completely dependent on the United States.
Okay,
so,
Paul, I'm going to jump in here. Let me get Webster back in on this because we're almost out of time. Webster, your final thoughts. Will they attack Iran or not, in your perspective?
I think there is a real danger. I think that has to be taken very seriously. The U.S. ruling elite is in a kind of collective war psychosis at this point. If you saw Hillary Clinton and Susan Rice essentially hissing and apoplectic with anger after the Russians and the Chinese vetoed that Syrian resolution yesterday, I think you can get a sense of the mental instability of these people. One of the things that's driving them is the potential collapse of the dollar, and I think this maybe looks a little bit different than what was just said. There's a group in Wall Street that says, start a war in the Gulf, close Hormuz, or get Iran or somebody else to do it, make the tanker traffic impossible, get the price of oil up to $500 or $1,000 a barrel, because that's a way to save the dollar. If the dollar is collapsing, you can generate a huge artificial demand with a war.
Okay. I got to turn to San Francisco, get Mark in. Mark, final thoughts, 30 seconds.
In 1968, and in February of 1968, the anti-war movement, anti-Vietnam War movement, there was no way that anyone could have even imagined in their wildest dreams that within a month, the sitting president of the United States would go on TV and effectively resign. He said he would not run for re-election in the fall of 1968. Anything is possible.
Okay.
We can and should consider the horrors of war, but we could end war forever. We
all
need
right.
to get
On that
together
note, I am so sorry, but we are out of time. I'd like to thank all my guests, Paul Wolf, human rights and international lawyer in Washington, Mark Mason from the Occupy movement, protester in San Francisco, and right here in Tehran, in studio with me. My pleasure to have Mr. Webster Tarpley, author, journalist, and lecturer.
Thank you very much.
And always a pleasure, viewers, to be with you in another show. Stay with us for another look at one of tomorrow's top stories on tomorrow's program. I'm Marzieh Hashemi, signing out for myself and all the crew here in Tehran. Thanks so much, and goodbye.